My name is Xavier Quinn. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in places where people assume they understand you within the first 10 seconds of meeting you. I've been called calm, reliable, quiet. Sometimes people use those words as compliments. Sometimes they use them as permission. If you met me in an office hallway, you probably wouldn't think twice. I'm not the loudest person in a meeting. I'm not the one fighting to be seen. I tend to listen more than I talk. I notice details that most people overlook, and for a long time that made me useful in ways that were rarely visible. People often mistake stillness for weakness. They assume silence means agreement. And when someone doesn't defend their space loudly, others slowly begin to occupy it. That's the story I want to tell you today. This isn't a story about revenge. And it isn't about dramatic confrontations or shouting matches in conference rooms. It's about something much quieter than that. A few months ago, I had surgery. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that my doctor insisted I take medical leave. I followed the rules, filed the paperwork, handed off my responsibilities, and trusted that when I returned, things would more or less be the way I left them. But the first morning I walked back into the office after recovering, I noticed something strange. At first it was small, just a moment of hesitation when I reached my department floor. Then I saw my desk, or at least what used to be my desk. Someone else was sitting there, using my computer. My chair adjusted to someone else's height. My notebooks were pushed to the corner like forgotten clutter. And standing nearby was my boss. The same boss who had approved my leave. The same boss who had reassured me that everything would be waiting when I returned. Except it wasn't. He had given my desk to the new hire while I was on medical leave. In that moment, nobody shouted, nobody apologized, no one even looked particularly uncomfortable. To them, it was probably a small logistical decision. To me, it was the first visible sign of something that had been happening for years. Because the truth is, what happened that morning didn't start with my surgery. It started long before that, with how people saw me, what role they quietly assigned to me, and how easily they believed my silence meant I would always accept it. What happened after that day changed more than my job. It changed how I understood power, respect, and the quiet ways people reclaim their place in a room. But before we get there, you probably need to understand who I was to them. And I'm curious about something before we go further. Have you ever had a moment where you realized a place you thought was yours quietly stopped being yours without anyone telling you? In every office, there are people whom everyone notices the moment they walk in, and then there are people like me. I joined the company a little over 6 years ago, back when the firm was still small enough that everyone knew everyone's coffee order. At the time, my official title was Operations Coordinator, which sounds simple until you realize that operations often means everything no one else wants to manage. Schedules, internal systems, vendor contracts, documentation, the quiet infrastructure that keeps a company running when nobody is paying attention. I wasn't hired to lead meetings or give presentations. My job was to make sure things didn't break. And for a long time, that's exactly what I did. In the early days, I stayed late more often than anyone noticed. If a system failed, I fixed it before most people arrived in the morning. If two departments stopped communicating, I quietly rebuilt the process between them so deadlines didn't collapse. People appreciated it, but appreciation has layers. At first, it was the kind that feels warm. Quick thank you emails. A manager mentions your reliability in a meeting, but over time, appreciation changes shape. It becomes an expectation. An expectation, if you're not careful, slowly becomes invisibility. I remember the first time I noticed the shift. It was during a quarterly planning meeting about 3 years into my job. The leadership team had gathered to discuss expanding one of our service divisions. Charts filled the screen. People talked about projections, new hires, and restructuring. I sat near the end of the table with my notebook, listening. At one point, the conversation stalled. There was confusion about how certain internal workflows would scale if the new division launched. People started guessing. One manager proposed a complicated restructuring that I knew, with absolute certainty, would break our system within a month. I had spent the previous year maintaining that system, so I spoke. Not loudly, just enough to be heard. I explained the dependencies, the automation triggers, the invisible parts of the workflow that no one else tracked. The room got quiet for a second. A few heads nodded, and then one of the directors leaned back in his chair and said something that seemed harmless at the time. "Good catch, Xavier. That's why we keep you around." The room laughed lightly. I smiled too, because on the surface it sounded like a compliment. But there's a subtle difference between respecting someone's expertise and valuing their usefulness. One recognizes your mind. The other simply acknowledges your function. From that moment forward, I noticed the pattern more clearly. When things ran smoothly, nobody mentioned operations. When something broke, someone would say, "Let's ask Xavier." I became the person people called when they needed clarity, but rarely the person invited when decisions were made. Not because anyone actively pushed me out, but because the role I occupied in their minds was already defined. Reliable, quiet, supportive, not central, not strategic, and certainly not someone whose absence would disrupt the structure of the room. If I had pushed harder back then, spoken louder, demanded recognition, insisted on a different role, maybe the story would have unfolded differently. But that wasn't how I worked. I believed that consistency would eventually speak for itself. That if I kept showing up, solving problems, documenting systems, and supporting the company's growth, people would eventually see the full picture. It's a comforting belief, but sometimes consistency doesn't elevate you. Sometimes it simply teaches people that you will always be there, no matter how much they rely on you, and no matter how little space they leave for you in return. Looking back now, I realized something important. By the time my surgery happened, by the time I walked back into the office and saw someone else sitting at my workstation, the role they believed I played in that company had already been written long before I left. Most people imagine workplace disrespect as something obvious. A harsh comment in a meeting, a public dismissal, a moment so clear that everyone in the room can see it. But in reality, the first signs are almost always smaller than that. So small, in fact, that if you point them out, you risk sounding overly sensitive. The first time it happened to me, it barely lasted 30 seconds. It was a Monday morning operations sync, one of those weekly meetings where department leads gathered to talk about timelines and internal coordination. I wasn't technically a department lead, but I attended because most of the processes they discussed ran through systems I managed. By that point, I had already built several internal automation tools that saved the company hours of manual work each week. Everyone used them. Few people thought about who maintained them. During that meeting, the product team was struggling with a recurring delay between client onboarding and project kickoff. It had been happening for weeks, and the conversation was circling the same confusion over and over. I knew exactly why it was happening. A small configuration conflict between two scheduling systems. It wasn't dramatic. It just needed a simple fix. So when there was a pause in the conversation, I spoke. "I think the issue might be coming from the onboarding trigger," I said. "The calendar sync probably isn't passing the confirmation flag correctly. If we adjust the automation rule, the delay should disappear." I kept it short, clear, practical. For a moment, the room went quiet while people processed it. Then my manager, Daniel, nodded slowly. "Right," he said. "We should probably look into the onboarding automation. That's likely where the bottleneck is." And just like that, the conversation continued. No one looked at me again. The idea I had just explained was now floating in the room as if it had appeared on its own. I didn't say anything, not because I didn't notice, but because, technically, Daniel hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't claimed the idea outright, he had simply repeated it. Meetings move quickly, people paraphrase, it happens all the time. Still, something about the moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Later that afternoon, I fixed the automation rule myself. The onboarding delays disappeared almost immediately. The next week, during the same meeting, Daniel mentioned the improvement. "Looks like the onboarding automation issue got resolved," he said casually. "Nice to see that cleaned up." Again, nobody looked at me. And again, I stayed quiet, because the truth is, moments like that are incredibly easy to rationalize. You tell yourself it wasn't intentional. He probably forgot who mentioned it. Recognition isn't the important part anyway. At least, that's what I told myself. And maybe once or twice that explanation would have been fair, but the strange thing about small moments like that is how they accumulate. One overlooked comment, one repeated idea, one quiet assumption is that someone else will take care of the details. None of them feel significant on their own, but together they begin shaping the way people see you. Not as the person who creates the solution, just the person who implements it. And in environments where perception quietly determines authority, that difference matters more than most people realize. At the time, though, I didn't think of it as disrespect. I thought of it as something even simpler, a misunderstanding, one small cut that would probably never happen again. Of course, it did. After the first time something like that happens, you become slightly more aware. Not suspicious, just observant. You start noticing patterns that previously blended into the background. And once you see them, it becomes harder to pretend they aren't there. Over the next year, moments like the one in that Monday meeting didn't disappear. They simply evolved. Sometimes it was an idea I mentioned in a smaller conversation that resurfaced later in a leadership discussion, this time coming from someone else, slightly rephrased. Other times, it was more subtle. A document I had spent hours structuring would circulate through the team, only to return later with a different name at the top. Not maliciously edited, just quietly reassigned. The strange thing about these moments is that none of them were big enough to confront. Each one lived in that uncomfortable space where speaking up risks making you look petty instead of correcting the situation. And I knew how offices worked. People don't usually remember the first person who noticed a solution. They remember the person who repeats it confidently in the right room. For a while, I told myself it didn't matter. My work still had an impact. Systems were improving. The company was growing. Recognition wasn't the goal. At least that's what I kept reminding myself. But perception has a way of solidifying over time. One afternoon, I overheard something that made that realization clearer than I expected. I had walked into the break room to refill my coffee, and two coworkers from the client services team were talking near the window. They didn't notice me at first. One of them was explaining a new process we had implemented for handling client onboarding, another system I had spent weeks designing. The other person nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah," she said. "Operations finally got that organized." Operations. Not Xavier, not the person who had built the entire structure from scratch, just operations. It was a small distinction, but it revealed something important. In their minds, the work I did didn't belong to a person. It belonged to a function, a role. And roles, unlike people, are replaceable. That was the moment I realized how thoroughly I had been categorized. Reliable, quiet, supportive, the kind of person who would fix problems without needing attention. The kind of person who would continue doing the work, whether or not anyone acknowledged it. And the truth is, for a long time, that assumption was correct. I stayed quiet, not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed that stability mattered more than visibility. The company was growing quickly, people were under pressure, leadership was constantly juggling priorities. I told myself that demanding recognition would only create unnecessary friction. So I kept doing what I had always done. I documented processes, I refined systems, I fixed things before they became visible problems. And every time someone repeated one of my ideas or forgot where a solution came from, I told myself the same thing. It's not worth disrupting the room. That's how normalization works. Not through a single dramatic event, but through repetition. The more often something happens without being challenged, the more natural it begins to feel. To everyone else in the room. And eventually, even to you. By the time my 6th year at the company began, the pattern was fully established. People relied on me constantly, but they rarely thought of me when discussing strategy, growth, or leadership. In their minds, I was part of the infrastructure. Important, yes, but invisible. And when people see you that way long enough, they begin making decisions about your place in the room without ever asking you. I didn't know it yet. But that assumption was already setting the stage for something much bigger than overlooked credit in a meeting. It was preparing them to believe that my absence wouldn't change very much. At some point in every workplace, people begin assigning roles to each other that have nothing to do with official titles. There's the person who always speaks first, the person who smooths over tension, the one who brings new ideas. And then there are people who quietly hold everything together. That was the role I had been given. Not formally, not intentionally, but through years of small interactions that shaped how others perceived me. If a meeting was running late, someone would look toward me and say, "Xavier, can you capture the action items?" If a system crashed, someone would message, "Xavier, do you know what's going on?" If two departments disagreed about a process, the conversation usually ended with, "Let's just ask Xavier what the workflow is." At first, that level of trust felt meaningful. Being the person people depend on can feel like respect, but over time I started noticing the boundaries of that trust. People relied on me for answers. They rarely asked for my opinions. They wanted clarity. They didn't necessarily want perspective. I remember a planning session about a year before my surgery that made this distinction impossible to ignore. The leadership team was discussing whether the company should expand into a new client segment. It would require significant operational adjustments, new onboarding structures, new reporting pipelines, and different compliance steps. All things that would eventually pass through systems I maintained. I sat quietly through most of the discussion, listening. Eventually, someone asked, "Do we know how complicated this would be to implement?" Several heads turned toward me. I explained the operational side as clearly as I could. What systems would need to change? Which automations would need rebuilding? How long would the transition realistically take? When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then Daniel smiled politely and said something that sounded reasonable on the surface. "Thanks, Xavier. That's helpful context." Context, not input, not participation in the decision itself, just background information. The conversation moved forward without me. They debated timelines, marketing strategies, and hiring projections. My role had already been fulfilled the moment I provided the technical explanation. I wasn't expected to remain part of the discussion, and what struck me most wasn't frustration. It was how comfortable everyone seemed with that arrangement, including me. Because the truth is, when you occupy a role long enough, it begins to feel natural. People don't question the structure. They simply move within it. I was the person who ensured the company's systems ran smoothly. The reliable one. The organized one. The quiet problem solver in the background. And as long as I kept doing that job well, everyone assumed the arrangement worked for me too. There was another side to that assumption, though. If someone is seen primarily as support, it becomes easy to believe their position is flexible, that they can shift desks, change responsibilities, be temporarily replaced, or quietly moved out of the way if something new appears. because support roles, by definition, are designed to accommodate others. Looking back now, I can see how the story was already forming. Not through hostility, not through obvious conflict, just through a shared understanding that no one had ever said out loud. Xavier will handle it. Xavier will adjust. Xavier will make it work. And as long as I continued fulfilling that role without objection, no one had any reason to question it. The problem with unspoken expectations is that they grow stronger over time, and eventually they become the foundation for decisions people make when you're not in the room. Change rarely arrives the way people imagine it. It's almost never a dramatic moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. More often, it's quiet. A single realization that slips into your thoughts and refuses to leave. For me, that moment happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. The office was unusually quiet that day. Several people were traveling for client meetings, and the usual rhythm of conversations and keyboard noise had softened into something almost peaceful. I was sitting at my desk reviewing system logs from one of our internal automation tools. Nothing urgent, just routine maintenance work that helped prevent bigger problems later. The kind of task that rarely attracts attention but keeps everything functioning. As I scanned through the logs, I noticed something interesting. Over the past year, nearly every operational process in the company had gradually become connected to systems I maintained. Client onboarding triggered automated scheduling pipelines. Scheduling pipelines fed into reporting dashboards. Reporting dashboards informed billing and forecasting tools. And nearly all of those connections passed through documentation, scripts, or automation layers I had built or refined over time. It wasn't something I had planned deliberately. It had simply happened as the company grew. Whenever a problem appeared, someone would ask if operations could streamline it. And because I understood how the systems connected, I usually found a way to improve the process. Piece by piece, the infrastructure evolved. What struck me that afternoon wasn't pride. It was perspective. For years, I had been thinking about my role through the lens everyone else seemed to use. Support, coordination, maintenance. But when I stepped back and looked at the full picture on my screen, the structure looked very different. The systems weren't just running smoothly. They were interdependent. And that meant something important. If any one piece of that infrastructure changed suddenly, without someone who understood how the parts interacted, the entire structure could become unstable, not broken, not just complicated. The kind of complexity that slows a company down in ways people don't immediately understand. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the nearly empty office. Most of the desks were quiet. Coffee mugs left behind, monitors asleep, a few jackets hanging on chairs. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had never seriously considered before. What would happen here if I stopped quietly holding everything together? Not in a dramatic way, not by breaking anything, just by stepping back, by allowing the systems to exist exactly as documented, without the quiet adjustments and preventative fixes I performed almost automatically. The thought didn't feel satisfying. It felt clarifying, because for the first time I realized something that had been hidden behind years of routine. My value to the company had never been tied to how loudly I spoke in meetings. It had been embedded in the structure of how things worked. And structures have a different kind of power than personalities. They aren't always visible. But once people begin depending on them, their absence becomes very difficult to ignore. That realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it made me calmer, because it changed how I saw my own silence. Up until that moment, I had treated silence as patience, a way to avoid unnecessary conflict. But sitting there in the quiet office, looking at the network of systems running across my screen, I began to see another possibility. Silence could also be space. Space to observe, to understand, to prepare. Not for confrontation, but for clarity about where I actually stood. At the time, I didn't know how important that shift in perspective would become, but it marked the beginning of something subtle. For the first time in years, my silence stopped being automatic and started becoming intentional. After that afternoon, nothing changed on the surface. I still arrived at the office at the same time each morning. I still attended the same meetings. I still answered the same questions about workflows and system issues. To everyone else, I was exactly the same person I had always been. Reliable, calm, quiet. But internally, something had shifted. Before, my silence had been instinctive. It came from wanting the work to move forward smoothly, without friction or unnecessary attention. Now it came from observation. Instead of immediately filling gaps in conversations, I started listening a little longer. When someone made an assumption about how a system worked, I waited to see how the room responded before clarifying. If a small inefficiency appeared, I documented it before fixing it, not out of spite, just out of curiosity. I wanted to understand something I had never fully examined before. How much of the company's stability depended on quiet interventions no one noticed? The answer revealed itself gradually. One morning, the marketing team spent nearly 20 minutes discussing a reporting delay that normally took me less than 2 minutes to correct. I had noticed the issue earlier but hadn't addressed it yet. Instead, I watched how the conversation unfolded. 3 different explanations surfaced. None of them was accurate. Eventually, someone messaged me privately. "Hey Xavier, do you know what's going on with the dashboard?" I fixed the issue quickly, and the problem disappeared. The meeting moved on. No one asked how the fix worked. They simply assumed the system had corrected itself. Moments like that became increasingly familiar. The more I stepped back, the more visible certain patterns became. People were confident about decisions in areas they only partially understood. They relied heavily on processes that had been quietly refined over the years, and perhaps most interesting of all, they interpreted my calm presence as proof that everything underneath was stable. Silence, in their minds, meant reassurance. What they didn't realize was that silence can also mean evaluation. Over the following weeks, I began keeping more detailed notes in my leather notebook, the one I carried everywhere. Not emotional notes, operational ones, where certain processes depended on undocumented knowledge. Which departments relied most heavily on automation layers? Where responsibilities overlapped in ways that weren't obvious on the organizational chart. It wasn't about gathering leverage. At least, that's not how it felt at the time. It was more like mapping a landscape I had been walking through for years without ever fully drawing. And once the map started forming, something became impossible to ignore. The company's leadership believed the structure was simpler than it actually was. From their perspective, operations looked like a support function. From mine, it looked more like a central nervous system. Not because I controlled everything, but because I understood how everything connected. That knowledge changed the way I interpreted certain comments. When someone said, "Operations will handle it," I no longer heard it as appreciation. I heard it as an assumption that the invisible systems and the person maintaining them would always be present, would always adapt, would always absorb the complexity so the rest of the company could move faster. For years, I had accepted that expectation without questioning it. Now, I simply observed it. And the more I observed, the clearer something became. Most people weren't intentionally dismissive. They were simply operating within a version of reality where the foundation beneath them never moved. They had no reason to think about what might happen if it did. At that point, I still had no intention of disrupting anything, but the quiet part of my mind had begun asking a different kind of question. Not whether the structure depended on me, but how deeply. And sometimes understanding a structure is the first step toward realizing where its pressure points live. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like routine. The same meetings, the same emails, the same calm presence at a desk that most people walked past without thinking twice. From the outside, my days still appeared unchanged. But quietly, I had started paying attention in ways I never had before. Not to people's personalities or office politics. Those things shift constantly and rarely lead anywhere productive. Instead, I focused on systems. Systems are honest in ways people often aren't. They reveal where work truly happens, where responsibilities overlap, and where assumptions hide inside daily routines. And the more closely I examined the company's infrastructure, the clearer something became. Much of what kept the organization functioning smoothly existed in places no one else looked. Over the years, I had written hundreds of small documentation notes, guides explaining how certain automations worked, how vendor integrations connected, how internal reporting pipelines were structured. But like most documentation in growing companies, many of those notes had never been centralized. They lived in private folders, personal reference files, draft documents waiting to be organized later. At the time I created them, they were simply tools to help me work faster. Now they look like something else, a knowledge archive. I began quietly organizing it, not to hide anything, just to make sure everything I understood about the company's operational structure was written clearly, accurately, and in one place. Process maps, automation dependencies, backup procedures, vendor contact chains, every connection that linked one part of the system to another. The more I documented, the more I realized how much of the company's operational memory existed in scattered fragments across my laptop and notebooks. No one had asked me to gather it, but no one had ever asked whether it already existed either. At the same time, I started observing another layer of the organization: decision flow. Who approved what? How projects actually moved from idea to execution, where bottlenecks appeared. Again, I wasn't looking for weaknesses. I was looking for structure, because once you understand how decisions travel through an organization, you begin to see which roles are visible and which ones quietly hold everything together. One evening, while reviewing a process map I had been refining, I noticed something almost amusing. Several of the company's most important client onboarding workflows depended on automation rules I had written years earlier. Those rules were stable, well-documented, and rarely needed adjustments, which meant most people had forgotten they existed. From leadership's perspective, onboarding simply worked. And from mine, I knew exactly which triggers, conditions, and fallback steps kept it running. The interesting part wasn't the automation itself. It was the realization that if those systems ever required significant updates, very few people would know where to start. Again, that didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. Because infrastructure knowledge isn't the kind of thing you use against people. It's the kind of thing you protect carefully. Still, organizing that knowledge changed the way I moved through the office. When someone mentioned a new initiative, I mentally traced the operational paths it would eventually touch. When leadership discussed growth targets, I mapped the back-end adjustments they would eventually require. For the first time, I could see the company not just as a workplace, but as a system of interconnected parts. And once you see something that way, you also begin noticing where the system assumes stability, where it assumes certain pieces will always function quietly in the background. Pieces like operations, like documentation, like the person who had spent 6 years ensuring the machinery underneath the company remained smooth and invisible. The irony was that none of this preparation looked unusual. No one noticed extra work happening. No one asked why I had become slightly more meticulous about documentation or process mapping. From their perspective, I was simply doing what I had always done: keeping things organized, maintaining systems, making sure nothing broke. They didn't realize that understanding a system completely gives you something unusual. Not control, but clarity. clarity about what matters, clarity about where your role actually sits within the larger structure, and clarity about something else I hadn't fully recognized before. If a system depends on knowledge that only one person truly understands, that knowledge eventually becomes a form of quiet leverage, not something loud, not something aggressive, just undeniable. And the first time I fully realized that, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, because clarity changes the kinds of decisions you're willing to make next. The moment of clarity didn't arrive in a meeting. It didn't happen during a conflict or after a difficult conversation. It happened late in the evening, long after most people had left the office. I had stayed behind that day to review a system update that one of our vendors had recently announced. It was a routine task, just checking compatibility with our existing automation pipelines. Outside the office windows, Seattle was already slipping into that soft gray-blue color the sky takes on after sunset. Inside, the office felt almost silent. I was halfway through tracing one of the integration pathways when something caught my attention: a dependency chain. One automation triggered another, which then fed into a reporting function that connected to billing and forecasting dashboards used by leadership every week. I had designed the sequence years earlier when the company was much smaller. Since then, new tools have been added. Different teams had layered additional features on top of the system, but the core trigger logic was still mine. I followed the chain slowly, step by step: onboarding confirmation, scheduling activation, project pipeline creation, reporting flags, financial tracking inputs. It was elegant in the quiet way good systems often are, each step passing information cleanly to the next. But what struck me wasn't the design. It was the realization that nearly every department relied on the final outputs of that chain. Sales used the pipeline data, finance used the forecasting signals, client services depended on the onboarding triggers. From the outside, it looked like a natural part of the company's infrastructure. From the inside, I knew exactly how it worked. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long moment, not because something was wrong, but because for the first time I saw the full picture all at once. 6 years of incremental adjustments, hundreds of small decisions, tiny improvements layered quietly on top of each other. None of them is dramatic, none of them celebrated. Yet together they formed something essential: the company's operational heartbeat. And I was the person who understood it most completely. That realization didn't come with excitement. It came with stillness. Because once you see something clearly, you can't return to the old version of the story you were telling yourself. For years, I had believed my role was supportive, helpful, necessary perhaps, but ultimately replaceable. Now I understand something more complicated. Replacing a role is easy. Replacing understanding is not. Not when that understanding is distributed across systems, documentation, and experience gathered over years. I closed the automation panel on my screen and opened the documentation archive I had been organizing. Page after page of process maps, system diagrams, dependency notes. Everything was written carefully enough that someone else could eventually learn it, if they were willing to spend the time. And that's when the final piece of clarity arrived. The company had never asked how deeply its infrastructure depended on undocumented knowledge. They had simply assumed that operations, like electricity or internet access, would always be there when needed. It wasn't arrogance. It was comfort. Comfort was built on years of stability. I saved my work, shut down my computer, and packed my notebook into my bag. Walking through the quiet office toward the elevators, I noticed something I had overlooked before: how much trust organizations place in things they rarely examine. Processes, people, systems that function smoothly enough that no one questions their foundation. The elevator doors closed and began descending slowly toward the lobby, and standing there alone, I felt something unexpected. Not resentment, Not satisfaction, just clarity. Because when you finally understand the true weight of your role inside a structure, you also realize something else. You have choices. Choices about how long you remain invisible. Choices about how much responsibility you continue carrying without acknowledgement. Choices about whether stability should always depend on the same quiet person in the background. At that moment, I hadn't decided anything yet, but the illusion I had been living under for years, that my presence was easily interchangeable, had quietly dissolved. And once an illusion disappears, it never quite returns the same way again. Clarity has an unusual side effect. Once you see the full structure of something, how the parts connect, where the dependencies live, how stability is maintained, you can't pretend that your role inside it is accidental anymore. For several weeks after that evening in the office, I didn't act on the realization immediately. Instead, I carried it quietly with me like a new lens. Meetings felt slightly different when you understood the architecture beneath the conversations. Comments about simple operational adjustments sounded different when you knew how many invisible layers supported those adjustments. Still, I continued working exactly as before, because understanding something doesn't automatically mean you need to change it, until circumstances force the question. That moment arrived the morning my doctor called. The surgery itself wasn't unexpected. I had been monitoring a medical issue for months, and eventually the specialists agreed that a procedure would solve it permanently. Nothing life-threatening, but recovery would require several weeks away from work. When I told Daniel, he reacted exactly the way a reasonable manager should. Concerned, supportive. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "Your health comes first." He even offered to redistribute some responsibilities across the team while I was gone. At the time, I appreciated that, because I had never been the type of employee who wanted to prove dedication by ignoring personal limits. So I prepared the same way I approached any operational transition. Carefully, I wrote detailed handover documents explaining how key processes worked. I outlined where certain automations lived, which vendors handled which services, and where important system documentation could be found. I didn't assume anyone would master everything immediately, but I believed the information would help. On my last day before leave, I walked through several of the workflows with a colleague who had volunteered to cover some operational tasks while I recovered. The meeting went smoothly. She took notes, asked thoughtful questions. Everything felt organized, predictable, responsible. By the time I left the office that afternoon, I felt comfortable that the company would function normally while I was away. And that's when the quiet decision finally formed in my mind. Not out of frustration, not out of resentment, but out of honesty. For years, I had believed my value inside that company depended on how much stability I quietly provided. Now I understand something different. Value also depends on how people choose to treat the stability you create. And sometimes the only way to truly see that treatment is to step away. Not dramatically, not with confrontation, just long enough for the structure to reveal how it behaves in your absence. That realization didn't feel like a strategy. It felt like an experiment. A simple question I was finally willing to let the world answer for me. What happens to a system when the person who understands it most completely steps out of the room? Would the organization respect the space I left behind? Or would it quietly rearrange itself as if that space had never really belonged to me at all? I didn't know the answer yet, but I was about to find out. Because a few weeks later, after surgery and recovery, I walked back into the office expecting to resume my work. And instead, I saw something that made the answer unmistakably clear. Someone else was sitting at my workstation, using my computer. My notebooks were pushed to the corner of the desk like forgotten objects. And standing nearby was Daniel, the same manager who had told me to take all the time I needed. When people imagine moments like that, walking into an office and finding someone else sitting at your desk, they often imagine anger, shock, arguments, voices raised in confusion. But the truth is, my first reaction was much quieter. I simply stopped walking for a moment. Not long enough for anyone to notice. Just a pause as my mind adjusted to the image in front of me. The workstation was unmistakably mine. The same dual monitors I had calibrated years earlier. The small plant is near the corner of the desk, and my leather notebook pushed slightly to the side as if it had been in the way. The new hire, a young analyst I vaguely recognized from a recent onboarding email, was typing quickly, focused on the screen. Daniel stood beside the desk explaining something. Neither of them had noticed me yet. In that brief moment, several thoughts crossed my mind. Not accusations, just observations. They had clearly assumed I wouldn't need this space anymore, or perhaps they had simply believed it was available. Either way, the decision had been made without a conversation. Without even a message asking how I planned to transition back after my medical leave. I walked the remaining few steps toward them. Daniel looked up first. "Oh, Xavier," he said, sounding mildly surprised. "You're back already." "Already," I nodded calmly. My recovery went well. For a moment, there was a small silence between us, the kind that appears when someone realizes a situation isn't quite as straightforward as they expected. Daniel gestured lightly toward the desk. "We've had the new analyst sitting here while things shifted around," he explained. "Just temporarily." The analyst turned slightly in the chair, looking uncomfortable. I offered a small, reassuring smile. "It's fine," I said. And strangely enough, I meant it. Not because the situation didn't matter, but because something inside me had already moved past the point of reacting emotionally. The question I had quietly carried into my medical leave had just received its answer. The structure had rearranged itself, without hesitation, without asking, and without considering what returning to that space might look like for me. That clarity changed what happened next. Instead of arguing about the desk, I simply asked where I should sit. Daniel pointed toward a smaller workstation near the side of the floor. "We set up a temporary space over there," he said, "just until we sort out the seating plan." Temporary, another word people use when they expect something to be accepted quietly. I thanked him and walked toward the new desk. Smaller monitor, different chair, no personal items, just an empty workspace waiting to be occupied. I placed my bag down and opened my laptop. From the outside, it probably looked like I had accepted the situation without much thought, maybe even without noticing its significance. But internally, something important had settled into place. Because the moment you truly understand how people see your role inside a system, you also understand how they expect you to behave when that role shifts. They expected patience, adjustment, quiet cooperation, the same calm reliability they had grown accustomed to over 6 years, and for the moment, that's exactly what I gave them. I worked through my emails, reviewed system alerts, answered a few operational questions that had accumulated during my leave, all without mentioning the desk again. Not because the situation was unimportant, but because decisions made in reaction are rarely the ones that shape the future. Decisions made in clarity are different. And that afternoon, sitting at that smaller temporary desk, I realized something with absolute certainty. If the company believed my role could be rearranged that easily, then the next steps I took would need to be just as quiet, just as deliberate, and just as irreversible. For the first few days after I returned, nothing dramatic happened. In fact, the office looked exactly the way it always had. People moved between desks carrying coffee cups. Meetings started and ended on schedule. The new analyst continued working at the workstation that had once been mine. If anyone felt awkward about the situation, they hid it well. And I didn't bring it up. Instead, I focused on observing something I had been curious about for weeks. how the system behaved when the person who understood its structure stopped quietly correcting it in the background. Before my medical leave, I had developed a habit that most people never noticed. Whenever a small operational inconsistency appeared, an automation delay, a mismatched data flag, a vendor notification that could eventually become a problem, I usually fixed it immediately. Not because anyone asked, just because I knew it would save time later. But after returning, I approached those moments differently. If something wasn't urgent, I documented it first. Then I waited, not to create problems, just to see how the organization responded when the invisible safety net wasn't constantly being adjusted. At first, the differences were subtle. A reporting dashboard updated more slowly than usual one afternoon. The finance team spent an hour investigating before asking if operations could look into it. I checked the logs and saw the cause instantly. A minor trigger conflict. Normally, I would have corrected it before anyone noticed. This time, I simply explained where the issue was and how it could be resolved. The fix itself still took less than 2 minutes, but the process leading up to it had taken an hour. No one complained, but people began asking more questions. A week later, the client services team experienced a delay during onboarding for a new corporate account. Nothing catastrophic. Just a pause where an automated step failed to activate exactly when expected. Emails started circulating between departments trying to identify the cause. Eventually, someone forwarded the thread to me. Again, the answer was simple. One small configuration change introduced during my absence had altered the sequence of an automation rule. It wasn't wrong, just incomplete. I explained the adjustment calmly, updated the documentation, and closed the loop. Still no confrontation, still no visible tension, but something subtle was beginning to change. Before my leave, operational problems rarely lasted long enough for multiple teams to notice them. Now, small delays have time to surface. And when they did, people started realizing how many processes depended on pieces of infrastructure they didn't fully understand. The interesting part wasn't the problems themselves. It was the questions they triggered. Where does this automation actually live? Who set up the reporting trigger? Is there documentation for this workflow? The answers usually led back to the same place. My documentation archive, my notes, my explanations. None of this created panic, not yet. But the office atmosphere had begun to shift slightly. In meetings, people asked more operational questions than before. Leadership occasionally paused discussions to confirm how certain back-end processes worked. And once or twice, I noticed something I hadn't seen in years. People are waiting for my input before moving forward with a decision, not dramatically, just cautiously, as if they had begun sensing that the systems underneath their plans were more complex than they previously believed. All of this happened quietly, without accusations, without anyone directly acknowledging the deeper reason behind the shift. Because the truth is, organizations rarely recognize structural dependencies immediately. They notice them gradually, through small moments of friction, through delays that used to resolve themselves, through the subtle realization that certain kinds of stability were never as automatic as they seemed. And as those realizations accumulated, something else slowly began forming in the background. Not resistance, not conflict, but awareness. The kind of awareness that makes people start looking for the person who understands the system best, even if they hadn't truly seen that person before. Awareness doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly, one small realization at a time. By the third week after I returned from medical leave, the office had begun experiencing something unfamiliar, not chaos, not failure, but friction. The kind that slows conversations, the kind that forces people to pause and ask questions they never had to ask before. The systems were still functioning, but they were no longer invisible. One morning during a leadership meeting, I watched that shift unfold in real time. The company was discussing a new client contract, one significantly larger than the accounts we normally handled. The opportunity excited everyone in the room. Sales had already outlined revenue projections. Marketing was discussing expansion strategies, but eventually the conversation reached the point it always did: operations. Daniel turned slightly toward me. Xavier, do we foresee any issues integrating a client of that scale into our onboarding pipeline? 6 months earlier, I would have answered instantly. I would have already prepared the infrastructure adjustments before the meeting even happened. Instead, I opened my notebook slowly. Possibly, I said calmly. The room went quiet, not because the answer was alarming, but because it was uncertain. I explained the dependencies clearly. Certain automation layers had been modified during my medical leave. Some documentation had been reorganized. A few internal workflows were now relying on temporary adjustments made by different teams. None of those things was wrong, but they created a structure that required careful review before scaling up. For the first time in years, the room wasn't completely confident that operations could instantly absorb a major expansion. Daniel frowned slightly. How long would it take to confirm everything is stable? I considered the question carefully. A few weeks, I replied. The silence that followed was subtle but noticeable. Sales shifted in their chairs. Marketing exchanged glances. A few weeks weren't catastrophic, but it meant delaying decisions they had already begun planning around. No one argued. No one blamed anyone. But the room had suddenly realized something they hadn't considered before. Operational certainty had never been automatic. It had been maintained, quietly. And now that maintenance wasn't happening the same way. Over the next several days, similar conversations appeared across the company. Teams wanted confirmation that processes were stable. Leadership asked for deeper documentation reviews. Departments began realizing that small changes introduced during my absence had ripple effects across systems they didn't fully understand. Again, none of this created an immediate crisis, but it created something more uncomfortable. Hesitation. Projects that normally moved quickly slowed down while people double-checked operational details. Meetings included longer explanations, more questions, more reliance on the documentation archive I had quietly organized months earlier. And eventually, Daniel asked to speak with me privately. His office was quieter than usual that afternoon. He closed the door and sat across from me, leaning back in his chair with the expression people wear when they are trying to understand something that suddenly feels complicated. I didn't realize how interconnected some of these systems were, he admitted. I nodded. They've grown gradually over the years. He glanced at the notebook in my hands. Do you think we underestimated the operational complexity here? It was an honest question. Not defensive, not hostile, just late. I chose my words carefully. I think the systems were stable long enough that no one needed to examine them closely. Daniel sighed softly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Because the truth had already settled into the room. The company hadn't intentionally dismissed the work happening behind the scenes, but they had become comfortable assuming it would always be there. And now, as projects slowed and decisions required deeper analysis, they were beginning to understand something uncomfortable. Stability isn't permanent. It's maintained by people. People who eventually have to decide whether maintaining it quietly is still the role they want to play. By the time Daniel looked back up at me, I could see the realization forming behind his eyes. But by then, the situation had already moved beyond something that could be corrected with a simple conversation. Some decisions only reveal their consequences after the structure shifts. And once that shift happens, you can't always return to the way things were. Daniel waited a few seconds before speaking again. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he was choosing the safest way to say it. I want to make sure we're supporting you properly now that you're back, he said carefully. The sentence sounded reasonable, supportive even. But the timing made it complicated. 3 weeks earlier, support had meant something different. Now it felt more like damage control. I nodded politely. I appreciate that. Daniel leaned forward slightly. I also want to make sure we're structuring things in a way that prevents situations like your medical leave from disrupting operations again. The phrasing was subtle, not your health, not your recovery, operations. I didn't react immediately. Instead, I flipped open my notebook and turned to a blank page. What kind of structure did you have in mind? I asked. Daniel seemed relieved by the neutral tone. Well, for example, we might consider redistributing some responsibilities across the team. That suggestion made sense, in theory. But I had learned something over the past few weeks. Redistributing responsibility and redistributing understanding are two very different things. You mean documentation and training? I asked. Exactly, Daniel said quickly. So more people can step in when needed. I wrote that down. Documentation, training. Then I looked up. That would take time, I said calmly. Daniel nodded. Of course. Another short silence followed. Then I asked the question he hadn't expected. Should we also discuss compensation adjustments if the role expands? Daniel blinked. The reaction was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The conversation had been about structure, about stability, about protecting the company from future disruptions, not about redefining the value of the person maintaining that stability. He leaned back in his chair again. That's something we could evaluate later. Later, a familiar word. I closed the notebook slowly. Of course. For a moment, the conversation drifted back towards safer topics. Documentation timelines, training sessions, possible cross-team workshops. But the tone had shifted, because once compensation enters the discussion, it reframes everything else. Eventually, Daniel sighed quietly. Can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Do you feel like the company didn't support you properly before your leave? It wasn't an accusation. It was a test. I thought about the question carefully. Then I answered with equal care. I think the company prioritized operational continuity. Daniel didn't interrupt. So when the system failed unexpectedly, I continued, the focus remained on restoring stability. I paused, and not on examining why that stability depended on a single person. The room went very quiet. Daniel rubbed the edge of his desk with his thumb. That wasn't intentional, he said. I know, I replied, and I meant it. Companies rarely design fragile systems deliberately. They grow that way through convenience, through habit, through the quiet assumption that the person holding everything together will simply keep doing it. Eventually, Daniel looked up again. So where do we go from here? The question sounded simple, but it carried a weight neither of us acknowledged out loud. Because the honest answer wasn't just about systems. It was about trust, about expectations, about whether the role I had played for years was something I was still willing to maintain. I closed the notebook and stood up. For now, I said calmly, we stabilize the systems. Daniel nodded slowly. And after that, I gave a small, polite smile. After that, I said, we decide what the future should look like. He watched me for a moment as I walked toward the door, because he understood something now that he hadn't before. The conversation about structure wasn't finished. It had only just begun. And this time, the terms would not be decided quietly in the background. A few months after that meeting with Daniel, something unexpected happened. Nothing dramatic, no public announcements, no sudden restructuring emails. Just a quiet shift, the kind you only notice if you are paying attention from the beginning. The documentation project we discussed slowly took shape. Training sessions began. Systems that had once lived only inside my head were now written down, organized, and shared across departments. At first, people treated it like an efficiency initiative, a best practice improvement. But over time, the real effect became clearer. The company was no longer dependent on a single invisible layer of stability. And interestingly, once that stability became visible, so did the person who had been maintaining it. Not because I demanded recognition, but because transparency changes how people see things. Daniel's tone shifted too, not dramatically, just noticeably. When we spoke in meetings, he asked questions instead of making assumptions. When new projects appeared, he included me earlier in the discussions rather than after decisions had already been made. Respect didn't arrive like applause. It arrived like space. Space to speak. Space to decide. Space to say no. And that last one mattered more than I expected. Because the most important change didn't happen in the company. It happened to me. For years, I had quietly accepted a role that others defined. Reliable, efficient, invisible. I believed that being useful was enough. That if I worked hard enough and stayed patient enough, people would eventually notice the value I created. Sometimes they did, but most of the time they simply grew accustomed to it. Not out of cruelty, out of habit. And habits rarely change unless something forces them to. My medical leave forced that moment, not intentionally. Not strategically, but once it happened, I realized something important. Being invisible is not always something others impose on you. Sometimes it's something you participate in. You stay quiet, you fix problems silently, you protect systems that never officially belong to you. And slowly, people stop seeing the effort required to keep everything working. They only see the result. The calm, the stability, the illusion that nothing ever breaks. Now things are different, not because I became louder, but because I became clearer. Clearer about what I do. Clearer about what I'm responsible for. Clearer about what I'm willing and not willing to carry alone. The company didn't change overnight. Organizations rarely do. But the relationship between me and my work did. And that changed everything. These days, when I walk into the office, I still pass the same rows of desks, the same conference rooms, the same quiet hum of computers starting their morning routines. But I no longer feel like the invisible system behind the system. I feel like a person whose role is understood, defined, respected. Not because I fought for attention, and not because I punished anyone for the past, but because I finally allowed the truth of my work to exist in the open. And once something becomes visible, it can't easily disappear again. When people hear stories about workplace conflict, they usually expect a dramatic ending, a confrontation, a resignation speech. Someone storms out of an office while everyone watches. But real change rarely looks like that. Most of the time, it's quieter. When I came back from surgery and saw someone sitting at my workstation using my computer, it could have easily turned into that kind of dramatic moment. Anger would have been understandable. Embarrassment, too. But the truth is, that moment wasn't the end of something. It was the moment I finally saw something clearly. For years, I had believed that being dependable was the best way to protect my place, to be the person who solves problems without making noise. The person who made systems run smoothly so that no one had to worry. And in many ways, that instinct wasn't wrong. Dependability is valuable. Quiet competence matters. But what I learned through all of this is that stability without visibility creates a strange kind of risk. If no one understands what you carry, they also can't understand what happens when it disappears. Not because people are malicious, but because they simply don't know. When my boss gave my desk to the new hire while I was on medical leave, it wasn't a personal attack. It was a symptom. A system that relied on someone it didn't fully see. And once that system was forced to look closely, things started to change. Not instantly, not perfectly, but enough. Today, the systems I built are documented. The responsibilities I hold are understood. And most importantly, I no longer feel the need to quietly carry everything alone. That shift didn't require revenge. It didn't require humiliation. It only required clarity. Sometimes the strongest response isn't raising your voice, it's simply letting reality become visible. And once it is, everyone has to decide what to do with that truth. So now I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment at work where you realized the role people expected you to play wasn't the role you actually deserved? I'd really like to hear your experience, because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that reveal the most.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.